My name is William Apgar. I'm the Executive Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. Along with the other sponsors of this evening's forum, I'm pleased to welcome you to this discussion on making housing affordable for all Americans. Over the past 50 years or so, housing policy has been an area of both great achievements and great disappointments. Tonight we'll talk about many of the problems that confront the housing sector of the national economy. But it is important to recognize before we begin that, of course, we are blessed as a nation for the American people overall are among the best housed people in the world. Indeed, this success is itself a bit of a problem. Many have come to take the relative abundance of good quality and affordable housing for granted. Here in New England, as we move into the winter season, housing problem this weekend for many is getting the leaves out of the gutters so they don't leak, the roof doesn't leak, to get the lawn furniture off of the backyard and store it away. What housing problem, people say? Why do we need a national housing policy? Why we should be concerned about the topics of this evening's conversation? People often fail to recognize the relative abundance of good quality and affordable housing didn't just happen here in the United States, but was the result of decades of cooperative efforts of government and business organizations working together. As a result of these efforts over the years, the United States can point to many accomplishments in the housing arena. Our national housing finance system, of which we'll learn more about tonight, is the standard by which other countries emulate. Our construction sector is a constant source of new products and innovative building techniques. I could go on, but the housing prosperity that many enjoy is no accident. It is the result of decades of efforts of public and private institutions and organizations. At the same time, here at the Kennedy School, and most certainly at the Joint Center for Housing Studies, we are well aware of the pressing housing problems that remain, and especially are aware of the fact that housing prosperity that I mentioned is not shared by all. We see whole city blocks in ruins, wasted by years of disinvestment and neglect. We know that many of our national housing programs, developed with the best of intentions, have become to many to symbolize what's wrong with government. And yet, despite we understand that the national promise of a decent house for all is a promise that the nation is yet to honor. Yet, despite the important housing issues that confront the nation, housing struggles to claim a place in the national agenda. Even good news about housing doesn't get much press. No less the detailed information that people would need to understand the complex issues. This year, the Joint Center reported that the nation is in the midst of a housing boom of substantial proportions. The boom is fueled by the growth of jobs, by the favorable mortgage interest rates. These factors, among others, are starting to reverse the substantial erosion of homeownership that occurred in the 1980s. In 1995 alone, the number of homeowners increased by almost 1.7 million, and this boom is carrying over into the current year as well. Yet when we reported these facts in our annual report, The State of the Nation's Housing, the homeowners boom was news to many. It was front page news in almost 500 newspapers around the country. Homeownership on the rise, as if somehow someone had invented a stealth homeowner, and that 1.7 million homeowners slipped in the night into neighborhoods across the country without any attention. It's amazing how even the best news on the housing scene seems to disappear in the clutter of the other news. But it's not just good news about the growth of home ownership that's being ignored. There are also much good news on the housing policy front that receives little attention. For example, in my opinion, it appears that policy efforts to make fair lending and fair housing a reality are starting to pay off. Some of the recent increases in homeownership appear to be, at least in part, the result of improved access by minorities and other historically disadvantaged groups to mortgage credit. Now, for sure, there's a long way to go. Today, only 44% of African American households own their own home, compared to 70% of native-born white households. But it does appear that this shameful gap is beginning to erode and narrow. Moreover, there's every reason to believe that the recent growth in the number of minority homeowners is a result, in large measure, of business and government efforts to promote fair lending and affordable housing. It's the triumph of government policy working cooperatively with business groups. We hear little of this. There are other success stories as well known to many in this room, but often ignored in a larger policy debate. Here I refer to the wide range of community revitalization efforts now underway in neighborhoods across the country. Efforts that involve business and government leaders working along with not-for-profits, state and local officials to revitalize some of the nation's most distressed communities. Of course, it's way too early to declare victory, but the housing problems of inner-city poor loom large. Because the housing problems of the inner-city poor loom large. But it's equally important to recognize that many people are hard at work attacking and working on these problems. The growing number of successful activities, as important as they are, though, are often crowded out by continued focus on what's wrong with housing and the community initiatives. We have a chance to reverse this pattern tonight, to put some spotlight on important work that is now underway to expand homeownership and promote affordable housing opportunities for all. I'm sure that the panelists won't agree on everything, but they share a commitment to addressing important housing and community development problems, and I applaud them. For this, I applaud them. So as a housing junkie of the first order, this is hog heaven. I'm pleased to have a chance to moderate the discussion and look forward to the rest of the evening. But I do have to be the moderator, which means I have to do something to announce a few rules. I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn, give them a chance to make their remarks. I'm going to ask the speakers to comment on one another and have an opportunity to ask questions of the others. Then I'll take questions from the floor. I guess it's customary at this time to say that there is this feature about questions. They have a question mark. They have a certain intonation that comes at the short period of time after you begin the question. And I will try to enforce this rule, among others, so we can put maximum focus on the speakers and their thoughts. Our first panelist is Jim Johnson. Jim Johnson is chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Fannie Mae, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Many of you are familiar with Jim and Fannie Mae. If you own a home, you may know that Fannie Mae somehow was responsible for getting the mortgage into your property. You may not know that in one initiative that Jim launched, Fannie Mae is working hard to apply modern financial management techniques to simplifying the mortgage lending process, and in doing so, lowering the cost of mortgage lending and simplify the mortgage process for the benefits of American homebuyers. If you have pension funds or other investments, you may be one of Jim's boss, a stockholder, that is, or an investor in Fannie Mae. Since even though Fannie Mae is a government-sponsored enterprise, it's also one of the largest corporations listed on the New York Stock Exchange. If you're a student here at the Kennedy School, you may know Jim as Maxine Isaac's husband. Maxine, as you know, teaches a highly regarded course here at the school on campaigns and electoral politics. If you're a person like myself, a self-described housing junkie, you know Jim Johnson and Fannie Mae through their work with housing partnership programs and with their work with state and local officials and nonprofit groups around the country. And here in Boston locally with the Housing Partnership Office and with the Kennedy School of Government through their Fannie Mae Fellowship Program. What you may not know about Jim is he's a newfound author on a bit of a book tour discussing his most recent work, Showing America a New Way Home. Okay? I got extra points for that. A very interesting account of Jim's, one right there in the front row. There'll be signings later. A very interesting account of expanding opportunities for homeownership, a topic that Jim, I know, cares deeply about. So I'm happy to introduce Jim Johnson and looking forward to him to upping book sales from their current level.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm delighted to be here this evening. Let me say also a word of thanks to Joe Nye, a friend of many years, the dean of the school, and to Molly. Thank you very much for being here this evening. To Heather Campion, who organizes this forum so successfully. I don't think there's a more important public forum now in the United States than this one in this room. You have more people, I'm not touting myself at the moment, but I gather there is someone coming tomorrow and the next day and the next day who lends testimony to the fact that this is a very, very important forum and a very important contribution that the Kennedy School makes to the national dialogue. I want to say a quick word about Joe Kennedy, Congressman Joe Kennedy. There is no more effective leader in Washington on issues related to housing than Joe Kennedy. He stands up and fights on issues of discrimination, on CRA, on affordable housing, on federal government housing programs like no one else. And I think those of you who are here and in his district, I of course have no connection of any kind to politics, but I can't imagine having a better champion for housing than Joe Kennedy. So I'm delighted to be on the panel with you. And to Chris Oliver, who I work with closely on a variety of things, who comes from Chicago, who heads a large community development-based development firm in Chicago, who's also head of the National Housing Conference, and somebody who I'm looking forward very much to her remarks. I have 4 quick points I want to make, and I'll just run through those quickly, and then we'll get a lot on the table, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. The first is a point that Bill touched on, and that is that the American homeownership finance system is the most successful in the world, and it's something that we can be very proud of. It's the most consumer-friendly. There's more disclosure. We have fixed-rate mortgages, which is vital to protecting people from changes in interest rates, and we have more focus on special needs. It's the most financially efficient mortgage system in the world. If you look at our mortgage rates in the United States as compared with benchmark government bonds of similar duration in all the major industrialized countries, we have by far the greatest financial efficiency in providing mortgage money of any of the industrialized world. Third, we have the most favorable ratio of housing costs to family income. In the United States, on average, 2 to 3 times of annual income equals the price of a median house. In the UK, in London, it's 7 times. In Tokyo, it's 12 times. So we have a very favorable ratio of housing costs to family income. We have fewer financial barriers to home ownership in the United States than in other major industrial countries. And lastly, we have the most living space per dollar of investment by far than anywhere else in the world. The second point I want to make is that home ownership is a core value of American society. Home ownership is more important to families in the United States today than it has ever been. Over 80% of American families believe that it is a significant family goal to achieve home ownership. We have renters who overwhelmingly rent out of necessity rather than preference. We have over 70% of Americans who believe that home ownership is a very good or excellent investment. And by very large margins, if you ask people about their neighborhoods and about higher home ownership, people believe, and I believe correctly believe, that higher home ownerships means more stable families, better educational success, less crime, and more civic participation. Americans believe that things get better with more home ownership. Good as our system is, there are many gaps in the way we perform. The book that Bill was kind enough to hold up talks specifically about what we can do to do a better job of providing opportunity for home ownership. In that book, I outline a 10-point strategy. I'll just mention those points to get them on the table. We can talk more about any of them later. One of the things we've discovered through our survey work, we use Peter Hart and Bob Teeter, the Wall Street Journal and NBC pollsters. We've done a lot of survey work now about what people think about housing and about the home ownership process. The first thing we've learned is that there's a substantial information barrier, that many Americans are not comfortable with the terms of mortgage finance. They're not comfortable with the process of getting into the mortgage finance system. They don't know how to go about it. In many cases, there are language barriers. In many cases, there are information barriers. But if we're going to get the job done, we have to speak more effectively to more people in more languages, more in their communities, in order to overcome the information barrier. The second thing we know, and I spent a whole chapter on this in the book, is that we still have a very substantial problem with discrimination in the American mortgage finance system. Minorities do less well in the system. We have some overt discrimination, certainly, as we find it here and there, but we also have a lot of areas of differential of service. We have people whose needs are not addressed with the same vigor. We have people who are discriminated against in the real estate process and in the mortgage finance process, and that's something that we all have to do more about if we're going to have the kind of mortgage finance system we need. Thirdly, We need to do a better job with new immigrants. This is the biggest immigration decade since 1900 to 1910. The 80s and the 90s are providing to this country millions and millions of additional families who have a very strong and firm orientation to home ownership, who in many cases have an outstanding record in terms of their orientation to savings, and we have to do a better job of dealing with them. One of the things that we're increasingly now focused on at Fannie Mae is putting everything we do, not only in Spanish, which we have for some time, but also in Chinese and Korean and Vietnamese and Russian and other languages, so that we can deal with people in the process of coming to the country, in the process of achieving citizenship, so we can do a better job to make them a permanent home ownership part of American society. Fourth area has to do with counseling and getting people on the track to home ownership. Many people are not today prepared to take the step. We have to do a better job of making the transition with them so that they're a good mortgage risk. We need to have more incentives to save, because home ownership still has as its biggest barrier accumulation of money for the down payment and closing costs. That's something we have to do better. I think we can do better. Sixth, I think we have to be much more effective in getting the word out and getting the product development behind us on low down payment mortgages, so that we can get people into homes with a smaller equity investment who are good credit propositions, people who can stay in that home. No good is done by putting in people in homes they can't afford. So what we have to do is to make very carefully a calculation of whether or not, with a small amount of money down, with a look at the credit history that is flexible and that understands the variations in those credit histories, that we can get more people into homes that they can afford and that they can keep. There's tremendous potential for technology. We made a public commitment that we would take $1,000 out of the cost of originating a mortgage through technology over a 3-year period, through technological investment at Fannie Mae. If we do that, that is the equivalent, that $1,000 on $700 billion a year of mortgage origination. If we can take that $1,000 out through technology, that is the equivalent of a $7 billion down payment assistance program, because it comes right out of the cost of getting into a home. We need to do better with new products. We need to shape products for the elderly, where we have many people who are house rich and cash poor, and through a reverse annuity mortgage need to gradually pull that equity out of the house in a way where their home is still secure. We need to do better with rehab products. One of the things that we realize now is that there are more and more neighborhoods whose vitality will depend on rehabilitation, and without that rehabilitation they will not be able to survive as the neighborhoods that they are today. So that's an area where we have to do a better job. We have to do a better job with Native American housing. We have to do a better job with disability housing. We've got a lot of special needs that we know we can do a better job with. Ninth, if anybody's counting, anybody was able to count through that, we have to do an even better job than we're doing today with community partnerships. There are thousands and thousands of highly effective neighborhood-based organizations in the country whose know-how is increasing all the time. And if we can get all parts of the mortgage finance system working effectively together, that will make a very substantial difference. And finally, we need to reduce the costs of construction. We have layered on far too much costs now in the process of building a home in America. We have regulations that are requiring things that are not needed. We have costs escalating. The cost of the basic building materials now are a smaller and smaller percentage of what's required to build a home. As a matter of fact, in the last 10 years, the cost of building materials as a percentage of the total cost of the home have been cut in half. That is, the other costs have gone up in that proportion, so that we have to do something very substantial in terms of reducing costs. The fourth point, and this is a very important point, and I trust the others will talk about it, fourth and last point, is that the goal of providing decent, safe, affordable housing in good neighborhoods for all Americans requires, it absolutely requires, enlightened public policy and substantial public resources. What I've been talking about in the context of my book, in the context of home ownership, is largely a private mortgage finance system. That mortgage finance system will work well for up to 80% of American families. But there is another very substantial group of American families who have a need to be part of a policy environment and an expenditure environment that deals with their lack of income, deals with their needs, in a very forthright way. The policies that propel the private system have been in place for a long time. We have a mortgage interest deduction. We have CRA, thanks to Joe Kennedy and others. We have the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. We have home funds and CDBG funds. We have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We have the Home Loan Bank System. We have HUD, which plays an extraordinarily vital role in all of this through the FHA and other programs. And we have increasingly aggressive federal government enforcement of discrimination laws. All of that is required to do what we do today, and all of that is required to make further progress in the future. The second thing we need is a national economic policy which focuses on education and training and R&D and investment so that we're doing something about the falling real income of the people who have the most severe housing needs. That's an essential part of any strategy. And finally, we need federal expenditures and policies which address the housing needs of the homeless, those in public housing, those with special needs, and those who have incomes which don't put them in the category of being likely candidates for home ownership. We have a loss of affordable rental stock in America. We have people's percentage of income going to rent the shelter they need going up. More and more of their income is going to the shelter that they require. So these 4 points are my overview of what we need to do. I think we have a tremendously strong system. Housing is a core value. We have things we can do within the context of the current environment and the private mortgage finance system that will make a big difference, but we have to also have a public partnership in this if we're really going to get the job done for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Our next speaker is Christine Oliver. Christine is President and Chief Executive Officer of Chicago's Dwelling Association. It's Chicago's oldest and over the past 50 years, one of Chicago's most successful nonprofit development organizations. Christine also chairs the National Housing Conference, again an organization with a long and distinguished history. The National Housing Conference was formed in the 30s to provide a forum where business leaders, labor leaders, representatives of national government, along with state and local government officials and nonprofit housing groups, could come together to discuss important housing issues of the time. Housing issues have changed over the years, but under Christine's leadership, the National Housing Conference continues to be a force in the national housing policy debate. Christine's own organization, the Chicago Dwellings Association, is also hard at work, creating new approaches to addressing the housing, some of the nation's toughest housing problems. One current initiative, which I'm sure she'll talk about, the Orchard Park Townhomes, combines the energy of her group, working in partnership with a for-profit builder to develop mixed-income housing on land leased from the Chicago Housing Authority. The site of townhomes selling to middle-income people on the site at what was once a devastated public housing development is amazing to most. Through this and other efforts, Christine Oliver and the Chicago Dwelling Association is working to revitalize some of Chicago's most distressed inner-city areas. Welcome tonight, Christine Oliver.
Thanks, Bill. And thank you, Jim, for your kind words, too. First of all, let me say that it's an honor to be here tonight, and I'd like to express my appreciation for the Kennedy School and Dean Nye for extending an invitation to me. I'm somewhat humbled by the company that I'm keeping, and it's a sincere pleasure to be able to be with you. I'd also like to congratulate the sponsors of tonight's event, because I think they have had the foresight to allocate this much time and this much attention to discussing the issues of home ownership and affordable housing. Housing does indeed form the infrastructure of our communities and our cities, and it deserves our attention. It is in this nation's inner city housing that our most challenging social problems manifest themselves, and it is in changing the nature of how we provide that housing that we will create the foundation for the revitalization of our cities. I've always liked the word home because it represents more than just bricks and mortars to me. and more than just real estate. It's a symbol of hope and opportunity, and it implies a sense of belonging and of acceptance and security, and most importantly, a sense of community and family. But for millions of Americans, as we've already heard, and I'm sure we will talk about more tonight, and most alarmingly for millions of children, home means something very different. It means fear of gangs, guns, and violence rather than security. It means discrimination rather than acceptance. It means isolation from the mainstream rather than inclusion in the community. And it means an unbroken cycle of dependence and struggle rather than hope and opportunity. Affordable housing and home ownership are issues which lie at the very heart of the solution to these problems. How we solve the crises which face our cities today is no longer perceived as a partisan issue, but rather as a budgetary one, and it is driving how we deal with those issues. Most of my comments this evening are going to be focused on what is happening in our cities and how our cities are trying to address it. And because I'm from Chicago, most of my comments will be in the context of my experiences in Chicago. The problems that we have, the budgetary problems that we have, are not a result of putting too little money into housing. I believe we need to continue to fund housing, but we have thrown a lot of money at the housing problem. Since 1962, federal spending for assisted housing has risen from $165 million to over $31 billion today. If we continue to fund the Section 8 program at current levels, by 1999, outlays for Section 8 assistance alone will equal the entire HUD budget. And yet we're still serving basically the same people we served 20 years ago. And that's only about 30% of the people who qualify for our assistance. Much to our dismay, the lessons of our social history have taught us that the nature of our welfare system and the evolving structure of the urban family have served to reinforce the negative effects of poverty despite increased funding. We are now faced with the catch-22 dilemma. The very policies of the past, which have enabled us to become the best housed nation in the world, also lie at the heart of the current deterioration of our urban communities. Our past and current policies did not and could not anticipate the depth and complexity of the problems which our communities face today. So we must now create a new paradigm for solving our nation's urban problems. A major theme in this new paradigm is clearly focused on downsizing the role of the federal government in housing. And this is going to have tremendous impact on the cities. Current legislative proposals, such as the infamous mark-to-market, which will reduce and in many instances remove project-based Section 8 assistance from currently subsidized properties, are a strong indicator of the downsizing mentality. While Section 8 will be funded at increasingly lower levels, it is clear that the public housing program will change dramatically. The recent and what I would say very controversial public housing reform bill contemplated the virtual rescission of the Housing Act of 1937, which created public housing. Both the House and Senate proposed to replace the current public housing program with innovative programs to create, to the greatest extent possible, a mixed-income population of low and very low-income residents in public housing, including working families. It is in many ways a return to the original intention of the public housing program, to provide transitional housing for the working and non-working poor. And there were additional programs to provide supportive services, job training, and encourage privatization of as many administrative functions as possible. This is an area that we have ignored. We have thought simply if we house people, that's all we need to do. They can do the rest on their own. Clearly, we've learned over the last 20 years that that doesn't work. Throughout all these programmatic and policy changes, there are four recurring themes. Create diversity through a mix of incomes, attack the problem of isolation and impaction by encouraging dispersion through the use of vouchers and certificates, encourage upward mobility by requiring residents to participate in job training and social service programs. These changes reflect a new understanding, as I just said, that putting somebody into a new housing unit doesn't solve the problem. Lastly, there is the Back to the Future program to block grant all funds to the state and local level, thereby further reducing the role of the federal government in the city's potential to address these problems. But most troubled cities struggle with the problems of creating a healthy diversity in the face of large, poor minority populations which have been warehoused in severely distressed public housing developments and devastated ghettos, always isolated from the mainstream of society, hidden away while the middle class has retreated in many instances from these older cities to the safety and convenience of the suburbs. And in most cases, these same people that retreated from the cities are loath to move back to the cities or to welcome any of the poor families which are so isolated and concentrated within the urban communities. Exacerbating this situation is the continual decline of the school systems. Despite the city's best efforts, the persistent low educational achievement of inner-city youth have thwarted attempts to close the gap between the skill levels of inner-city residents and the skills demanded by an increasingly more technical job market. Thus, without better training, many inner-city residents are prevented from effectively competing in the job market. And this trend is exacerbated by the isolation of the poor to access to transportation or suburban housing opportunities. In order to effect a tangible, lasting transformation, cities must stabilize their troubled inner-city communities by encouraging social and economic diversity within the overall resident population. They must attract working families back to our troubled communities. Public and assisted housing must return to one of its most important original purposes, as I said earlier, providing transitional housing to the working poor, as well as the non-working poor. Cities must provide housing that poor people can live in within the mainstream of the community rather than creating housing for poor people in isolated ghettos. This task is made difficult by the shrinking stock of affordable rental housing. The reforms in the Section 8 program will send literally tens of thousands of low-income families out to seek rental units under the voucher and certificate programs. It will be difficult, at best, to provide housing for these families in many of our housing markets. Currently, the turnback rate on certs and vouchers is as high as 30% in cities such as New York, where the real estate market is extremely tight. This situation is again exacerbated and will be more exacerbated over the next 5 years as we experience, as Jim mentioned, one of the largest waves of immigration in our nation's history, as close to 9 million immigrants arrive on our shores, most of whom will initially seek rental housing before they move into home ownership. We will also lose rental stock as city locations become more desirable and buildings either raise rents beyond affordable levels or they convert to condos or co-ops. The low-income housing tax credit is clearly not adequate to meet the increasing demand, nor does it serve a wide enough range of incomes. Clearly, there is a continuing need for more creative financing mechanisms which will make development of affordable rental housing more attractive. Cities must offer more incentives and develop creative programs which provide such things as tax abatement, low-cost city land, coverage of infrastructure costs, and most importantly, methods to attract higher income residents back to the city and broaden the tax base. I'm delighted that Jim Johnson had the foresight to write his new book, Showing America a New Way Home, which we've just had the pleasure of seeing. Because I believe that increased home ownership for low to moderate income families is a critical part of the solution to both the shortage of rental housing as well as stabilizing the inner city communities. Not only does it provide people with the opportunity to accumulate wealth as they build equity in their homes, it also gives them an important stake in the continued viability of their community. Additionally, as more and more families, some earning as little as 60% of median income, are able to purchase homes, existing affordable rental units are freed up to meet the pent-up market demand. Developing mixed-income communities is proving to be an effective way for cities to address many of the problems which they face, and also a way to increase home ownership. It provides a way for cities to attract moderate-income families while creating and maintaining diversity within existing communities. Importantly, when carefully planned, it can assure low-income residents that they will be able to remain in their communities, that they will not be displaced by revitalization efforts and increasing property values. In 1990, I authored some federal legislation to create a demonstration for mixed-income housing in conjunction with public housing. A lot of what was in that federal legislation has been woven into the reform legislation for public housing that was before the Congress this year. The strategy employed was to design a program which would not only change the nature of hard-to-develop communities, but also address the problems which are endemic to the people who live there. It's designed to expand the supply of affordable housing and home ownership opportunities while creating new economic opportunities. We have currently are implementing it in the city of Chicago. The city has recently announced a plan to totally revitalize over 60 acres of land within and surrounding the infamous Cabrini Green public housing development. The city will contribute 30 acres and the Public Housing Authority will contribute 30 acres. Over 1,300 units of public housing will be demolished. This is, Cabrini Green has about 6,000 units of housing, so this is a significant reduction in the number of units and the impact in that community. A total of 2,000 new units will be built, of which 660 units will be allocated to public housing residents. There will be a mix, 50% mix of low to moderate income families and market rate families. There will also be a mix of single family homes, townhomes, and rental properties. The city will construct new libraries, new police department. They are actually demolishing a perfectly good school because they think the location is bad, and they will rebuild the school in another location. They've pledged up to over $1 billion over the next 5 to 7 years. Currently, I'm in the process of developing, as Bill mentioned to you, a 50-unit townhome community located within Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green has, for generations now, been perceived as one of the worst public housing developments in the city. And it is, I think, a good illustration of what major cities are facing with their public housing developments and with their devastated communities. The townhomes which I'm developing are located directly adjacent to 2 public housing elderly high-rises. The townhome community will have a mix of 75% market rate units affordable to middle-income families. The remaining 25% of the units will be sold to the Housing Authority and then leased to public housing families. The townhomes are also built on land leased from the Housing Authority under a 99-year lease. This is the first time this has ever been done in the country. The market rate townhomes in the first phase will sell from $150,000 to $190,000. And I want to tell you, the first phase sold out without any advertising at all. The public housing units are interspersed and cannot be differentiated between the market rate units. And that means people are willing to pay up to $200,000 to live in this community, knowing that they're going to be living next door to a public housing family. What that says to me is something very significant. It says that the issue that we have with public housing and our inner city communities is an issue not about race, it's not about income. It is really an issue that has to do with shared values. And people are willing to live in a lot of different situations as long as they know that they're living with people who share their values. I think that's important as we move forward in crafting public policy to identify that. The only thing that's also important to note is that to entice middle-income, moderate-income working families into the cities, you really need to give them some incentives. They need to know that they're going to have security. They do look for the same amenities or comparable amenities that they could find elsewhere, and they look for an economic incentive. But generally speaking, as long as you can provide those, they are willing to take the chance and move in. Gaining access to capital is at the crux of any strategy to revitalize our communities and provide economic opportunity. So we must keep that at the forefront of our thoughts as we move forward with these new innovative programs. Lastly, I want to wind up by just mentioning what I think is a new wave that's starting to happen in the country that is important to consider and should be debated and talked about and focused on. And that's the need for partnerships between for-profit and non-profit developers. So often, the for-profit developer is left with the task of developing within the inner city, which is the most difficult development to do. In many instances, while they have the will to do it, they do not necessarily have the financial wherewithal, nor do they have the technical expertise. On the other hand, for-profit developers are oftentimes looking, and particularly now in Chicago and other cities, looking for other places to develop, looking for new opportunities. If I can build townhomes as a nonprofit developer and know that I can sell them for $200,000, that means that there is an opportunity in the inner city for for-profit developers to work with nonprofits in joint ventures to help this vision become a reality. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Christine. Our next speaker is Congressman Joseph Kennedy. Joe, of course, is among friends here at the Kennedy School, and we welcome him back home. But for those of you who perhaps are visitors from a place that has no access to modern communications, who may require an introduction to Congressman Kennedy, perhaps a few biographical notes are in order. Congressman Joe Kennedy is the ranking minority member of the Housing and Community Opportunity Subcommittee of the House Banking and Financial Services Committee. Indeed, Congressman Kennedy has devoted much of his energies in Congress to expanding homeownership and affordable housing opportunities. His work, as Jim Johnson mentioned, in advancing the cause of fair lending and his efforts to strengthen the Community Reinvestment Act stand out among his many legislative accomplishments in the housing arena. So we truly are honored in having Congressman Joe Kennedy to speak with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was sitting here looking out and thinking, my God, this is the best behaved audience I think I've ever spoken before. You know, you guys are better than church on Sunday. And you're certainly better than any time I've ever been on the House of Representatives, where nobody listens and everybody's yakking at the same time. So feel free to talk amongst yourselves while I'm talking, because I'm used to it. Growing up with 10 brothers and sisters, you know, it kind of comes with the territory. I do have to say that it would take the Kennedy School to put a Kennedy and a Johnson back together on the same table. So, you know, And I do want to thank both my good pal Heather Campion and who puts up with Chuck and Joe Nye and their families and all of you here at the Kennedy School for sponsoring this event. It means a lot to me because the housing issue so often is swept under the rug of this country, and we don't pay a lot of attention to it, and yet it's so critical to the needs of so many very vulnerable people in this country, and so many of us take it for granted, as Bill sort of indicated in his introduction. And I think that while we have real leadership by people, and it really isn't plural, it really is singular in the sense of what Jim Johnson himself has done in his leadership of Fannie Mae. The truth is that that was an organization that was floundering for years, and I was very, very critical of his predecessor and others in the organization, and continue to give him a tickle now and again. But the truth is that the commitment that he has made of over $1 trillion worth of funding for affordable housing is a significant development and a significant departure from the past. And while we see the federal government really just pulling back in a tremendous way from its commitment to our poor and vulnerable citizens in this country, seeing Fannie step up to the plate is providing leadership, and I just wish that Freddie sometimes would follow Jim's demonstrations. But and I know as I look out on the audience and see so many of you that have really dedicated your lives in ways that don't necessarily line your own pockets with profits that are available to so many housing developers, and instead have chosen to use your knowledge to simply help others in this society, I think deserves special mention. As I was looking out, I saw a few old friends, and Aaron Gornstein and Barbara Burnham and Marv Siflinger and Ron Homer and Tom Callahan and Alex Bledsoe and Jim Farris and Tom O'Brien. If I could just ask you for your indulgence, Bruce Marks, who all of these individuals work in the nonprofit world. They house literally thousands and thousands of very ordinary families, and they do it without very much attention or without very many accolades. And maybe we could just give them a round of applause for the work that they do. You know, yeah, you see, now they're starting to do what happens on the House floor. I should have known the bankers, right? The bankers are yakking. But so I share sometimes a little story that I think people in public housing can really appreciate. I was asked by a pal of mine to come down to Nashville, Tennessee, to give a speech the other day, and actually to help him out with his election campaign. I said, well, okay, when I get there, you want me to endorse you or your opponent, you know, whatever will help. And he said, no, come on down. So I said, fine. So I go down and I walk in. Yeah, you get that now. Okay, so I walk, and there's about 1,000 people in this room, and the fellow he has introduced me is a guy named John Siegenthaler, who some of you in this room will remember worked with my dad back in the going back in the days of the Justice Department. He was one of the Freedom Riders, and he continued to work with my dad right up through his last campaign. And now he is the editor, or the publisher, I guess, of USA Today. But he was telling the story about about his first job in politics, where he was a young reporter working for the Nashville Tennessean, and the editor told him to go down and cover a guy who was running for re-election for governor. So he said he ran down to the State House, and it was this big long stretch limousine, the late 1950s, and he jumps into the limo, and they start driving, and they drive about an hour outside of Nashville, and the road turns from tar to dirt. They drive a second hour, and they start up the side of a mountain, and 3 hours later they arrive in this little village of Mountain View. And so the governor gets out, and he stands on this soapbox, and he gives this rip-roaring speech to about 6 people, and he ends the speech by saying, and I want to promise the people of Mountain View that the next time I come here, there's going to be a 4-lane highway built directly from Nashville to the tippy top of this mountain. And people go, golly, that's great, Governor. And he gets back in the car after a round of applause. He starts back down the hill, and John said, so I said, Governor, you know, I might be naive, and this is my first job in politics, but that just sounded like a bald-faced political lie. How could you possibly justify a 4-lane highway from Nashville to the top of Mountain View? And the governor said, John, if you're going to cover politics, the first thing you got to do is listen to what a politician says. And what I said was, the next time I visit Mountain View, there's going to be a 4-lane highway, and I have no intention of ever visiting that godforsaken place ever again. But in any event, there are a lot of people in public housing that can identify with that. The truth is that there is, despite the news we've heard to the good about housing ownership in this country rising, and that is, I think, in large measure due to a lot of the innovation and the creativity and the new financial services, the outreach, the partnerships that have existed between Fannie and some of the organizations that are here, the creative financing that many of the bankers, the commitment to the Community Reinvestment Act that so many of our financial institutions have made, and it's a terrific thing. And the innovations that Christine talked about in terms of what she's doing in Chicago sound wonderful. I don't know a lot about the details of the project, but it sounds like exactly the kind of partnerships that we need and ought to be encouraging. And I think that if you look at the record of Fannie, more than any other organization, and certainly in terms of the big financial organizations, has made a tremendous commitment, and has made a great commitment here in the city of Boston, and it makes a difference. But despite all that good news, folks, let's not kid ourselves. What this country did over the course of the last couple of years in housing is a tragedy and a shame. You've seen the federal funding in this country drop by 25% without even a hearing. We went down to Washington in 1994 and saw the federal budget cut from $26 billion to $22 billion. You've seen a complete cut of over $6.5 billion in terms of what our nation's commitment to affordable housing has been. Now, what does that mean in terms of the real world and how many people are affected? It means that there are people that right now are living in public housing, are living in assisted housing, are living in preservation housing, are living in Section 8s that are not going to receive them in the future. Whenever someone talks about, and I don't mean to single you out, Christine, but when people start talking about new paradigms, if you're poor, you better watch your pocket. Because what that means is somebody is going to come and take your housing unit away and give it to somebody who's a little richer. Now, maybe that's something that we want to encourage because we're warehousing too many poor people in too few units. But the truth of the matter is that if what we end up doing is just turning our back on the poor and not providing them with any help or assistance, and thinking that that's some brave new world that we ought to all somehow embrace, then I think it's a sad day for that kind of thinking in America. I think that it's time that all of us take a look at what has gone on in terms of housing policy in this country. And think back to maybe when you were a kid and how many homeless people you actually saw in the streets of America. Think back in the 1980s, prior to when Ronald Reagan came in and took a $30 billion housing budget and cut it by $8 billion. Cut the number of affordable housing units in this country that we were providing from 300,000 a year to 8,000. You don't provide affordable housing to the poor, and you create homelessness. In this country's policies in mental health, this country's policies in terms of providing funding for affordable housing, no question about it, created the homelessness problem in America. And not only that, not only did we cut the housing budget by 25% last year, but we came back in the same bill and cut 26% out of our homeless budget. We went from $1.1 billion to a $300 million cut. This year, I was told 2 weeks ago, my staff, Jonathan Miller, I saw in the back of the room a few minutes ago, said, Joe, you got to get on the phone and call up the grantees in Boston because we just got them $9 million. I said, well, Jonathan, how much money did we get them last year? He said, $14 million. I mean, that is going to hurt people. That is going to mean that there is real suffering that takes place. And we can talk about the fact that what we're going to do is you know, we're so sick and tired of looking at these god-awful eyesores of public housing and saying, look, they don't work. And it's such a tremendous thing for any politician, Democrat or Republican alike, to walk out in front of some god-awful public housing and point at it and say, look, the Johnson policies, the Kennedy policies, the early 60s policies, the activism just didn't work. It's a complete failure, and all you have to do is look at this building, and that's a demonstration of it. The truth of the matter is that we promised these local housing authorities that they'd get operating subsidies, and they never got them. So they built the public housing. We then warehoused the poor in the public housing, and then we never gave them the money to keep it up. Now, you can blame this all on the social ills of America. But sooner or later, you've got to look at the dollars and cents and see whether or not you actually put the money there. And I'm not talking about the preservation money. You know, Christine mentioned the fact that we put a lot of money into project-based Section 8. We do. It's been a terrible ripoff, and a lot of landlords have made unconscionable amounts of money off of a program that is absolutely outrageous. But that's not public housing, folks. I mean, we have to, and if you do something, as you know, as attending the Kennedy School here, and in those of you that are involved in setting public policy debates and trying to make sure that people in the society get a shelter. My goodness, what have we done to public housing authorities? I get letters now from public housing authorities welcoming this new legislation. The reason why the public housing authorities welcome the new legislation is very simply that they can't afford to take care of the poorest of the poor because we don't give them the money in the federal government. So what do? What did this legislation that was passed in the House this year, what did it accomplish? It essentially said to the public housing authorities that they could jack up the rents on the poor, they could throw the very poor out. That's how you get the new paradigm. That's how you get, working people in, is you throw the poor out. And so all I'm saying to you is that if what you want is a society where you can walk around and point to public housing and say, isn't it terrific? Isn't that great? You can get that, but you're going to have to pay for it. Unless at the same time you want to look at the street corner and find a lot of homeless people that have no place to go. Because with the tremendous success that we have had economically in America, it is not a success that has been enjoyed by all of the American people. There are a lot of people, particularly people of color. You heard that one little statistic, most impressive statistic I heard all night, was the fact that whites own houses at 70% and blacks own houses at 40%. It's ridiculous. And it isn't that black people are irresponsible. We condemn whole races of people in this country and say they can't be successful because we deny them access to real wealth. If you can't own your own home, if you can't own your small business, then all you are is getting by each week on your salary. And if many of you had to get by each week on your salary, and your salary alone, and you had no equity in any asset, you'd be in serious financial trouble. And your kids would be in financial trouble. And there'd be a continued cycle of poverty that you would live in generation after generation. We need to break that. We need to recognize that poor people are not poor because they have any less morality than rich people. That if we take the time, as we talk about so often on the House floor, of trying to invest in the third world by bringing capitalism to them, let's bring capitalism to the third world in America. Let's make sure that we're providing bank loans. And it isn't just the banks. The banks get an unfair burden here. The truth of the matter is, this city has more wealth in terms of mutual funds, and I have yet to see a mutual fund office open in the whole sections of my district. I have yet to see a securities firm. I've yet to see even some of the credit unions going into the poor sections of this city. And so what I'm trying to get across to you is, it isn't just a question of home ownership rates. It's a question of who's getting the home ownership. It's a question of who's getting the subsidies. It's a question of who's getting rich and who's staying poor. And if we can accomplish through Jim's knowledge and through Bill and Christine and the questions that you might ask, begin to get a sense of responsibility that we have to one another, and that we're not going to simply enter the brave new world by cutting off the most vulnerable amongst us, then in fact I think that this evening's forum will have really meant something. Thank you all very much. Nice to be with you.
First, I wanted to ask the other panelists if they had any comments to make at this stage. Questions of one another, or questions from the audience?
I'm afraid we're not going to get any questions from the audience.
Okay, so we ought to go ahead with questions. A couple of rules just to remind you. As you approach the mic, give your name, program, and organizational affiliation. We would appreciate if the first questions came from some Kennedy School students or other students in the university. We especially would look to that. And who's first? Okay, yes.
My name is Veronica Nyan. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and my question was regarding mixed income communities as a tool for rebuilding our inner cities. I agree that that's critical. I understand that there are incentives to bring homeowners back into the inner city. Are there incentives to bring business owners back into the inner city. My concern is how are you going to draw the homeowners with the lack of supermarkets, the lack of banks, the lack of stores to buy school supplies for children? And I'm not aware of any of those incentives. Do they exist?
Who are you asking the question to?
Any of you?
Any of us.
She's working on it directly.
Yes, actually, they are incentives. One of the things is it's a chicken and egg situation. What we're doing at Cabrini is we are giving incentives, they're tax incentives that are being provided to business owners to locate in that area. Particularly when you have a large planned development like this where over the next 5 to 7 years the city has committed over $1 billion and 60 acres of land, and the plan is out there and it's moving forward. Entrepreneurs are going to look at that and know that there's an opportunity there. And they're very excited about it, moving into it. I think one of my concerns would be, following up on the Congressman's comments, would be what opportunities will be provided for the low-income residents that are currently living in that community, and how will they be encouraged and helped to start up their own entrepreneurial enterprises. And currently CHA is working on programs and offering programs to the residents, training them in not only job skills but also starting up their own businesses so that they also can share in the transformation of the community in a meaningful way. And I might add, remain in the community. I think that's a very important issue, that people who have lived in their communities, as public housing goes through its transformation, that they are not displaced. That's what the whole point of trying to create the mixed income is so they stay there while the community goes through the gentrification.
Can I add just one thing? Sure. Let me just add one thing quickly, and that is that at Fannie Mae we're really focused on housing. We don't have much latitude to move into other things. On the other hand, we've just created now a new $100 million investment fund called the American Communities Investment Fund, where what we're looking at is equity investments, new capital that we can make in the inner city, where we see a project that will have a particularly strong catalytic effect. There will be a housing tie to it, but we're going to go a little bit broader with this fund than we've traditionally been able to do, so that we can get into areas where something important has happened and see if through additional equity investment we can have that catalytic effect and get more of the job creation and business creation that's needed to go along with the housing. So we're really just branching out a little bit into that now. It's not been a major focus for us in the past.
One of the other areas that is the whole area of insurance. I mean, the truth is that it's very difficult for small businesses to get insurance in the inner city, particularly minority-owned small businesses. We just had a group of us met earlier this week to try to get the insurance companies. You've got, in this state, you've got literally hundreds of billions of dollars. That you've got as much money as made in this state as taken in each year by the insurance companies in this state as is taken in by the entire state government. And yet, out of the 13 insurance pools for investment in the inner city that have been created, insurance companies have only participated in 3 of them, and I think it's to the tune of about $100 million. It's not just a question of whether they write policies. It's a question of whether they make investments in the inner city in order to make any kind of serious economic development a possibility. So we need to get the big boys to participate.
Okay. Thank you. Your question, please. Steve.
Hi, my name is Eric Christofferson, and I'm a junior at Harvard College, and I'm also a member of the Student Advisory Committee here at the IOP. I'm 20 years old, and I feel very fortunate to be in the position I am studying here at Harvard, but unfortunately there's a large number of people similar to my age, an underclass of youth that aren't as fortunate as I am, who maybe have not gone to college, who are working minimum wage jobs, and whose prospects for owning a home are really not that great. And I was wondering what sort of strategies, this is for any and all of you, you see to target my age group, those younger people who are less fortunate than others, and what you might suggest we do about that.
You want to start with that one, Jim?
Sure. I'd be happy to. That's, when I talk about what we need to do in housing, as you saw in the last point I made, I try to branch out to acknowledge that there's a fundamental change in the income distribution in the country.
and that there are a lot of people who are not doing well in the education system. There are a lot of people who are working at minimum wage jobs. There are people who are being left behind by the technological transformation. And so that even though it's not housing, I always talk about national economic policy, because if we don't do something more effective with the schools, and we don't do something more effective with training, we don't do more effective investment in R&D, and we don't do something that really focuses on giving people a chance, we are going to have a more and more difficult housing problem. Because what we're seeing is a loss of affordable rental housing. We're seeing more and more people who are losing ground economically, the bottom 20% particularly, but really the bottom 40%. And unless we address the overall sources of income and growth of income, we're going to find that we have not only two societies economically, but we're going to have two societies in terms of housing and shelter availability. And so it really is an intersection of housing policy and national economic policy and investment policy. And once again, it's not what I do during the day for a living, but it seems to me you can't talk about this picture without dealing with the point that you're making. And it's principally not inside Fannie Mae, but I want to be part of the coalition of people who always makes that clear, because if we don't make that clear, we're not going to get anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm working with a group in Chicago called AmeriQuest, and it's sponsored by the National Conference of Christians and Jews in conjunction with MGIC. It's a home ownership training program working through community churches and community organizations, and now branching out into employers to provide home ownership training and education to low-income families and individuals. And what they basically do to address your issue specifically is they sit down with a person, do a credit analysis and an income analysis, and tell them where they fall out in it, you know, whether they qualify, what they have to do to change their credit rating, and get them on a program where they can at some point see in the future the potential that they can become homeowners. And it's an active outreach into the community, so it reaches people that are members of community churches and organizations or work for large corporations, sometimes in low-level jobs, but at least it's reaching out to them and informing them of the opportunity that they have, which I think so many times doesn't happen. People don't know that they too could own homes, so they're afraid to ask the questions.
Thank you. I see we have a somewhat older student approaching the mic. Yes.
Yes. My name's Yale Rabin. I'm professor of planning emeritus from the University of Virginia, and I'm currently involved in a project somewhat similar to the one in Chicago in Baltimore. But my question is a locational one. Back in the 60s, there was a lot of controversy over a concept called gilding the ghetto, on the one hand, or providing opportunities for people who lived in the inner city to get out. Since that time, the conditions that were addressed during the 60s, as has been eloquently stated here, have grown far worse. Enormous numbers, over 6 million African Americans, are isolated in low-income poverty areas in the central cities. Not only is the housing poor, there is no employment, there is no transportation access to employment elsewhere, the schools are rotten, the housing is rotten, and the question is, where do we invest in attempting to change these conditions? Should our short-term strategy be to enable as many of these people to find housing where there are better schools, where there are job opportunities, or are we going to carry on what I think are really token projects of demolishing a few hundred public housing projects and building small, limited impact, mixed income developments in the inner city without being able to assure that the kinds of support systems, shopping, services, jobs, are going to accompany those developments?
What do you think? You want to try that one, Joe?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, I think, you know, this is how you create an economy in the inner city is an issue that has hundreds and hundreds of examples of success. The bleak sort of picture that you initially painted, I think, fails to recognize that there's a guy about 4 people back who can tell you that in Codman Square in downtown Boston, in Dorchester, that you know, is a community that represented some of the similar sort of qualities that you started off with, but today is fighting back. There's investments, there's jobs, there's small businesses, banks are coming back. They're creating health centers. You know, when a community wants to get together and save itself, when there's that core of people that are there that say that they're going to fight back, and there is a group of institutions that are willing to support them, then I think you can find that there will be private developers, there'll be nonprofits, there'll be all sorts of institutions that will really give them a helping hand. And you've got literally hundreds of people that dedicate themselves to bringing those neighborhoods back. There are, in this city, in the city of Cambridge and the city of Boston, there are literally dozens and dozens of neighborhoods that have come back, not just because they've been gentrified or yuppified, but because the people that have lived in those communities for decades have decided that they want to take their streets back and they want to build up their institutions, and they've been great success stories.
Okay. Question over here.
My name is Jed Kolko. I'm a graduate student here in the economics department. I believed, as you spoke, you all mentioned the primacy of increased home ownership as a goal. And I believe you all also lamented the lack of affordable housing, rental housing, the tightness of rental markets, low vacancy rates, and ever-escalating rents in the cities. You also mentioned that one of the causes of that is co-op conversion, conversion of rental units to larger owner-occupied structures. Because the supply of housing in a city in particular tends to be fairly fixed, isn't there some sense in which increasing home ownership directly contributes to the lack of affordable rental housing in our cities?
Okay. Want to try that one, Jim?
Sure. This is actually something that Bill has written a good deal about, so he could jump in and supplement what I have to say. But the biggest source of loss of affordable rental housing has to do with the failure to maintain that stock, to tearing down buildings for other economic purposes. There are a wide variety of factors that cause the loss of stock in rental housing far beyond the fact that it has been taken into home ownership. Christine really made the opposite point to you in her remarks, saying that part of what happens with increased home ownership is that there's an increased freeing up of rental units, and that has a very positive impact on the cycle. I think like almost anything else in real estate, this is the sort of thing where one gets it wrong if you generalize too much. And you've really got to look at the local market dynamic and the location of which you're talking about. But as a general proposition, the biggest problem in terms of affordable rental housing is not conversion to condominiums or co-ops or to ownership purposes. It's a loss of stock for other reasons. And if you get more home ownership, you can get more flow into the system, and I think you can free up units for rental by people who are now going to ownership.
Mm-hmm. Good. I think we have just time for one more question, and fortunately, it gets to be Ben, because when I talked to him in my class, I said, stand up at the mic, Ben, and ask a question. So.
I didn't want to let you down.
Okay.
My name is Ben Mang, and I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. My question is for Mr. Johnson, although I think you could all answer it to a certain degree. You spoke about the significant amount of discrimination that people face when they try to get loans for homes, and I know that a big part of the $1 trillion commitment by Fannie Mae is directed towards immigrants. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit any ramifications of the current fear-mongering and backlash against immigrants in this country, and if you felt that immigrants face some of the same issues of discrimination that other underrepresented groups in this country do.
Thank you. I like the opportunity of having a chance to talk about that. The most serious problem of discrimination has to do with African Americans. And you just can't fool around about that. That's what it is, and that's where it happens, and that's where the differentials in service are the worst. That's where the discrimination in the mortgage finance system is the worst. And that's where, throughout the process, you don't get the kind of fair treatment, equal treatment, enforced law that you need in order to make the system work fairly. And that's why you have 40% ownership among African Americans, and that is overwhelmingly the most significant dimension here. Now, I happen to believe that the current hysteria about immigration is a very serious issue and a very serious problem in the country. The talk about the people who are going out in front of public housing taking cheap political shots, it seems to me now that there are an awful lot of cheap political shots being taken around the issue of illegal immigration and border security and put over on top of what is an enormous strength for American society, and that is the millions of people who are coming to this country who are helping with the economic growth, with the home ownership thrust, with all the other things that have made our country so strong for so long. I've been very much in the middle of this debate. It's not a comfortable place to be. And as a matter of fact, I just lost a fairly important ally called Jack Kemp, who used to be on the right side of this issue and aggressively on the right side of this issue, and then, for reasons that may have been reported in the press, changed. This is vitally important. We can do a lot more, as I said in my remarks, in terms of dealing in the language that people are comfortable with. There are 33 million Americans for whom English is not the first language. So that we have a real challenge here of taking advantage of the orientation to savings, the orientation to family that many of the immigrants group have. And in many cities, frankly, when they pass through, initially with rental, the roots that they're now putting down in cities across the country is making a fundamental difference in the tax base of those cities and the ability of those cities to do a better job. So it's a complex issue. Discrimination is a very complex issue. We've got to get more people in the system who understand it in all its subtlety. But it's, first of all, an African American issue, and then only secondarily an issue that relates to new immigration.
Thank you. Got a comment? Well, we've come to our appointed hour. Thanks for the questions, and thanks to panelists for their insights. And you did want to say?
I mean, I could always comment on that. I just thought, I was trying to judge how many people really wanted to get out of here versus how many people wanted to hear what I had to say. Listen, I mean, very briefly, I just think that that Jim Johnson essentially said it, which is that the unfair attacks that are taking place against immigrants in this country do not take into account the honest appraisal that, if done, will tell you that this country makes money off of immigrants. The notion that immigrants cost U.S. taxpayer dollars is simply not borne out by the truth. The truth is that if you take the total number of tax dollars that they pay into the system versus the tax dollars that they cost the system, we make about $20 to $40 billion a year off of immigrants, both legal and illegal. And so I just think that underneath this is just a lot of hysteria and fear-mongering, and Jim's right to take on the issue.
Good.
Thanks, Bill.
Good. Thank you. So we want to thank our panelists and for a good evening.